Dry aging is the process of removing moisture from the product and allowing the lipids within the muscle to break down slowly over time. It's kind of a controlled deterioration of the muscle to get something that's much more tender and that actually goes through a flavor transformation, which we think is really important.
Dry aging is expensive, it's luxurious, but it just tastes incredible. I mean, that's why we go through the trouble. That's why we spend the extra money.
At Oak Steakhouse, our flavor profile that we've sort of gravitated to, it's pretty full-bodied dry aged flavor. It's adults only, it's not for kids. First timers that had tried dry aged, sometimes it's a little too much for them. Like I said, it's not for everyone. It really isn't. It's an experienced steak eater's cut.
It's almost become generic to describe it as sort of the notes of blue cheese, but that is precisely what it is. And in fact, if you look at a majestically aging loin or a rib of beef, you will see those veins that you get in blue cheese working their way through. And that is the same mold, and it does indeed have the same flavor profile.
During the dry aging process, you're taking the natural enzymes in the meat that would be active whether they're dry aging or wet aging. Wet aging is just in a bag. But dry aging, you're taking the meat and you're putting it out into an open air environment. So the natural enzymes are breaking down the muscle tissue, making it more tender. However, the cool part about dry aging is that you're allowing other environmental impact to be had upon that piece of meat. The notes that you get from dry aging, the flavor notes, the aromatics, are likely going to be imparted by the different molds and yeasts that are going to land on the meat and start populating it. One type of mold that we know that we're finding on there is Penicillium nalgiavense. It's a mold that's a very white, powdery mold that you're going to find oftentimes on salami. We're likely going to be finding some other molds common in the culinary world, the Penicillium roqueforti, which is going to be found in blue cheeses. You're going to likely find yeasts, which are part of the fungal kingdom, in particular possibly Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is used for brewing and baking. Now, the controls that we can incorporate into dry aging are often going to be temperature. Number one, it's very easy to control temperature for the most part, but then we try to control humidity somewhat to slow the migration of the moisture or get the right amount of migration of moisture during the dry aging process.
Temperature in here ranges somewhere between 37, 38 degrees on average. It's definitely not freezing. Freezing would stop all the bacterial activity and would stop the aging process, so we don't want to ever do that. Temperature is important because we want to age product for 30, 40, 45 days. And in order to do that, you definitely have to have temperature low enough. Otherwise, you'll end up with spoilage and something that spoils as opposed to aging correctly.
I don't recommend just anybody taking a piece of meat and put it in a refrigerator because you're not going to have the air movement that's necessary to get that uniform migration of the moisture out of the meat. The folks that do dry aging on a large scale, they're truly artists. From the meat science perspective, I get a lot of questions, tell me the science of dry aging. I can tell you what has happened, but I can't necessarily tell you what's going to happen. That's kind of the cool part about dry aged meats. It's going to be different no matter where you go or what you do. It's different in every environment, and you are left to the environment and what it's going to impart into the flavors.
Right now we have about 4,200 pieces of beef in here, well north of 90,000 pounds, and close to $900,000 in value. So this is more than just an avocation. This is a labor of love, but it's a financial risk-reward game as well. I think it's very hard to replicate a room this size with this much beef. You try to dry age 10 or 12 pieces of meat in a small box, it's never going to have the same patina that a room like this with 4,000 plus pieces of meat will have. We have a really perfect environment here for this. It's built for this. It's what we do, and I don't know that many restaurants can really replicate exactly what we do here.
Different rooms respond very differently to beef. You go to the Braga room, for example, and it's absolutely cavernous, it's massive. And when you have that much volume, paradoxically, it's easy to control than if you have a microclimate, right? Where the slightest variation will completely throw off the room. That room is so big that they have a little bit more leeway, let's say. It's also among the cleanest rooms. Like you go to the old school steakhouse where there's like wood everywhere and cardboard lining and like the steak, the guy looks as dry aged as the steaks he's pulling off. So, when you walk into the doors of steakhouses, it's like the first thing that hits you is that from the age box. But the Braga's not like that. I mean, you get those subtle notes, but it's almost like you're walking into a science lab, and I think that's how the modern butcher needs to approach dry aging. If you're getting into dry aging now, don't build a wooden box. We're in the 21st century.
It's like being in a cheese locker where you have tons of cheese and you walk in and you put a fresh piece of cheese in there and all the bacteria in that room start to work on the new cheese that you bring in. Same here. In a week, we'll put up 700, 800, 1,000 pieces of new meat in here. So we're introducing a ton of humidity, which is why we have the high-speed fans. That adds to our humidity level naturally, just by the amount of meat we put in every single week.
Anytime you start off with a premium product, you're going to have a premium result. With the marbling and the fat content of a prime, you're going to get more flavor as it dry ages.
So the marbling allows the penetration. The fat itself is softer tissue, it's more permeable, and it almost becomes a conduit for those flavors.
Marbling for me is the most important criteria. If you have a really great piece of marbled beef and you age it correctly, you should have a great finished end product for sure.
You can get kind of floral notes. You can get almost even an alcoholic note when you first cut into it. It's a beautiful smell that comes off of these.
Oh my God, George, you gotta smell that.
Those aromatics are still in the meat, and so when you cook meat, you're waking up the molecules that are there. You're exciting the molecules with the heat, and that's what comes up to our noses. That's what comes up to our olfactory senses. And that's where dry aging really takes this big leap beyond just conventional aging of meat. You really get that intense flavor. Not all folks like that intense flavor, but we're finding a lot of people do.
So I often draw the comparison of the difference between dry aged beef and wet aged beef as the difference between grape juice and wine. And wine is from the same liquid, yet because it's fermented, it's developed complex flavors far beyond regular grape juice. Regular grape juice is delicious. It's very sweet. It's refreshing, but it doesn't have a lot of complexity. Wet aged beef is delicious. I mean, look, who's going to turn down a juicy hamburger? But when you're making a steak, which is the most prized and important part of that animal, to elevate it with dry aging, I think, is the right way to really honor that animal's life, honor the process, and honor the guest, indeed.
I love wet age. I do. There's times when I've got to have the dry age. I'm chasing that flavor. They're both great, but they're both different platforms.
We're in the golden age of dry aging. People are pushing it. 28 days is what you really need, right, to get that steak to the proper tensile strength. There is some imposition of flavor on that, but the further you go, the more desiccated the meat becomes and the more profound and distinct the flavor is. So I've had steaks up to 420 days that are no longer beef.
We like the 50-day, 55-day age. It's a flavor that our clientele likes in Charleston. You get some of these ones that go a long time, 90 days, 85 days. Even personally, that's not the flavor profile that I'm looking for.
I think it's important to remember that at one time, all meat was dry aged. They were hanging whole carcasses. That has the same effect as dry aging, and now it's become a bit perverse, quite frankly, when you're just taking short loins and rib sections and dry aging them.
Dry aging is new to a new generation of people who are enjoying meat. Dry aging used to be what we always did. Prior to refrigeration, meat was always just kind of hung in open air environments, and there are still countries that do that. What's old is new, and what's new is cool, and that's what we're having, this resurgence in the meat community. Those who enjoy meat are really starting to better understand the benefits of dry aged meat. People are looking for this next level of eating experience, and that's what dry aging can really bring to folks.